level. Keep flying. I was just waiting for those horns. Should be coming soon, right? What you feeling down for? No, I like that. I like that. Just vibing right now. Don't be sad. Open your eyes. The sun is shining. The angels are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Better days are coming by and by. We can make it if we try. Come on. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way.
It's time to wake up.
Look around and then I see a little old man and a homeless lady. They don't have no food to eat. Father, give them a warm place to sleep. Come on, wake up the people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up. Good afternoon, family. It's a Saturday again. It is the Afrocentricity Book Show every Saturday between 4 and 6. It's really good to be on the airways again, speaking to the family. Happy New Year, everybody. If you're using this European calendar we're in at the moment, Happy New Year. Hope you guys all set some good plans. You need to write your plans down to kind of make them kind of concrete for the new year. If you've got some targets to achieve, you must list them so you know exactly what you need to do for this year. Let's make this year a year of liberation, liberating our minds, our communities and ourselves. So I must remind you, Afrocentricity Book Show is sponsored by Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, N15 5NH. That is Glass R Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can go to Glass R Us for all of your glazing needs. So whether it's glass repairs, double glazing, shelving, tabletops, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balustrades, you name it, please go to Glass R Us. If you mention this show, you'll get a 10% discount. So mention the Afrocentricity Show on Bless Radio and you'll get a 10% discount. So you can get Glass R Us on 0208 800 6663. That is Glass R Us. You can get them on 0208 800 6663. So, this is our first book show, Afrocentricity Book Show of the new year. And you lucky people, we are going to be reading a book by the great, his ancestor now, the Professor Jacob H. Carruthers. The book is called The Irritated Genie, an essay on the Haitian Revolution. Again, we're reading a book called Irritated Genie, an essay on the Haitian Revolution, written by our Baba, our ancestor now, Professor Jacob H. Carruthers. So why have I chosen this book? We must remember, for those who don't know, 1804, the 1st of January 1804, Haiti, correctly called Haiti, became independent, and they put down a new constitution, and they deemed themselves independent, from the rule of France under Napoleon. And this is a major, major, major event in our history. It's an event that we need to know about, because what they did, they made the impossible possible. They made the incredible credible, and they beat the 3 superpowers in the then world. So these Africans on the island of Haiti, which was called formerly Santo Domingo, or in French Saint Dominique, and they liberated themselves from enslavement, and they beat, in the process, the 3 superpowers that there were around. So who were these superpowers? The superpowers of the age were France, Spain, and also Britain. They beat the best troops from all these 3 nations. And we must remember, Napoleon's troops, they were beaten, or had beaten, all the best armies throughout Europe and Russia. And when they went to Santo Domingo, now called Haiti, they beat those troops as well. We should not forget as well that Britain wanted to re-enslave these people. And Britain sent something like 66,000 troops there. And again, they just defeated all of these troops there. So it shows you the genius of these people going back to their own culture, their African culture, and the power that it gave them. So when we read now The Irritated Genie, an essay on Haitian Revolution, it will give some serious facts, and so you gain a greater understanding, because it just shows you the power of culture, and the power of unity, the power of confidence in self, what it can do for you. Okay, so I'm going to start with the introduction, which is the best place to start. At the beginning of the book, there is an essay in honor of Dr. Bobby Wright. Dr. Bobby Wright, great psychologist. He wrote the book, which you should be aware of, called The Psychopathic Racial, I'll get back to the full title for you. I've got the book in front of me now. He's also done an excellent essay called Menticide as well. So he wrote this book, or he kind of dedicated the foreword of the book to Dr. Bobby Wright, great psychologist of our community. So Irritated Genie was published in 1985 by Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers. I met him here when he came over. He used to come over to do lectures. I also met him in the UK, in the US I should say, at a ASCAC conference, and he was a truly great scholar. Okay, so let me move on very quickly now. So this is the introduction from Irritated Genie, an essay on the Haitian Revolution. So he says, race vindication has long been a major theme in the consciousness of blacks living in the USA, United States. The success of Marcus Garvey in mobilizing and inspiring millions of blacks is due to his grasp and command of that fact. The aspiration is epitomized in this assertion: the world has made being black a crime, and I have felt it in common with men who suffer like me, and instead of making it a crime, I hope to make it a virtue. So that is the words of Marcus Garvey in his magazine, his newspaper called The Negro World, and that was published in January the 7th, 1928. So if I read it again, words of Marcus Garvey, the great Marcus Garvey: the world has made being black a crime, and I have felt it in common with men who suffer like me, and instead of making it a crime, I hope to make it a virtue. So early conceptualizations of this consciousness in the second decade of the 19th century, reflected in the Haitian Revolution, is a demonstration of race redemption. Prince Sanders published his Haitian papers in 1816 and delivered a major pro-Haitian lecture in 1818. A decade later, David Walker asserted in his revolutionary appeal of 1829, and David Walker says, Haiti is the glory of the blacks and terror of tyrants. I hope that she may be united, keeping a strict outlook for tyrants. For if they get the least chance to injure her, they will avail themselves of it. But one thing gives me joy, and this is that they, the Haitians, are men who would be cut off to a man before they would yield to the combined forces of the whole world. In fact, if the whole world was combined against them, it could not do anything with them. And that is from David Walker, from his David Walker appeal. A few years later, John Rossworm asserted, another African scholar, the Haitians on the auspicious day of January the 1st, 1804, declared themselves free and independent nation, and thus they can demonstrate that they still are men alike sensible to all the miseries of slavery and to all the blessings of freedom, and that the independence of Haiti was laid the foundation, an empire that will take a rank with the nations of the earth. The most definitive assessment of the Haitian Revolution by a 19th century black in the United States was made in a lecture by Reverend James Theo Holly, and this was made in 1857, who explicitly tied race vindication to the example of the Haitian Revolution. His analysis provides the context for the theme taken in this essay. In introduction, Holly said, "It is then to attempt a fearless but truthful vindication of this race with which I am identified that I now proceed to set forth the following address. This revolution is one of the noblest, grandest, and most justifiable outbursts against tyrannical oppression that is recorded on the pages of the world's history. A race of almost dehumanized men, and women I must add, made so by the oppressor, slavery of 3 centuries, arose from their slumber of ages, and readdressed from their own unparalleled wrongs with a terrible hand in the name of God and humanity. In this terrible struggle for liberty, the Lord of hosts directed their arms to be the instruments of his judgment on their oppressors as the recompense of his violated law of love between man and his fellow man, which these tyrants of the New World had been guilty of in the centuries of blood, wrong, and oppression, which they had perpetrated on the African race, on the isle in the Caribbean Sea." So that was Holly, 1857. Holly's oratorical attempts to make a fearless but truthful vindication of his race is ultimately reflected in what the Haitians had done. In fact, what makes the Haitian Revolution an exemplary model for race redemption and vindication of their race. So the question ushers in a host of queries about the event, which has been so obscure to most blacks in the 20th century. It would seem that Holly's own words, that even the most exemplar, because the masses of blacks arose from the slumber of ages and redressed their own unparalleled wrongs with a terrible hand. The fact that these blacks were able to successfully defeat the greatest European army and win their freedom in armed battle, thus seems to explain why Haiti was the glory of the blacks. To David Walker and Reverend Holly, thus the spirit that motivated them and their leaders that directed their spirit are a vital concern for all of us who are interested in a model of black race vindication. This work will explore both the spirit of the revolutionary Haitian people and the reaction of the heroes and leaders of the revolution to that spirit. So a note of related literature. So I'm going to move on. So we really need to go into the book. He's just talking about some of the books that he uses, some of the sources he used. So rather than dilly-dally on that, I'm going to move straight into the book, okay? Let's take a quick drink, so excuse me. So, The Irritated Genie of Haiti. The liberator of Haiti, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, in his speech accepting the office of Governor General for Life of the newly independent black nation, referring to the possible attempted invasion of Haiti, asserted that upon their approach, the irritated genie of Haiti, these are the words of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the irritated genie of Haiti, looming out of the bosom of the sea, appears. His menacing face rouses the waves, stirs up the storms, and his mighty hand smashes or scatters their ships. We may well describe the spirit of the Haitian Revolution as the irritated genie of Haiti. In his lecture, Holly described how the furious genie held back its full wrath until the hour of destiny appointed by the Almighty told its summons for him to arise and avenge the wrongs of ages. Thus the core of black vindication was race vengeance, the spirit of the revolutionary Haitian people. This spirit was recognized and appreciated by knowledgeable blacks in the 19th century, and even those who eschewed the violence and advocated racial harmony. As indicated above, the examples of the actions of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution and their relationship to the irritated genie is the focus of the study. 4 leadership groupings can be identified among the blacks, and these are related more or less to the chronological progression of the struggle. These groupings overlapped in membership, but are identifiable in most cases because in most cases one man was considered the commander-in-chief, and thus his philosophic orientation to the spirit of the revolution set the direction that guided or misguided the irritated genie. There was also a group heading for a group of free men of colour who played a significant role in the events. There were also scattered independent military bands from some of the free black communities that must be included in the study of black revolutionary spirit and leadership. The contention in this paper that it was a success on the part of the leaders was related to the extent to which they were inspired by the irritated genie or possessed by the spirit of the Haitian Revolution. Race vindication with its core of vengeance was the only central or realistic revolutionary philosophy. Those leaders were possessed by a formulated realistic goals, strategies and tactics. Those who abandoned it formulated unachievable goals and thus misdirected strategic and tactical operations. Leaders who followed the genie not only were in harmony with the aspirations of the masses, They were also realistic in assessing the nature of the problem and in pursuing solutions which were workable. In order to shed light on the problem, this work is organized into 9 chapters. In the second chapter, the foundation of the revolution will be examined on the activities of the blacks who escaped and established independent black villages, and those who, from these bases or among the slaves, launched rebellions. Third chapter will analyze the beginning of the revolution under the leadership of Bookman. The next chapter examines 3 leadership groupings. The first, headed by Toussaint, who was tended to dominate the attention of those who studied the revolution. Toussaint's leadership is further analysed in chapter 5. The transition from the leadership of Toussaint to Dessalines is the focus of the next chapter, and the following 2 chapters deal with the leadership of Dessalines, the Avenger. A concluding chapter reviews the study as it relates to the historical and contemporary struggles for the liberation of African people. Certainly, the emphasis on race is in keeping with this historical development of blacks, nationalism among blacks living in the USA. Martin Delany, lifelong struggle for race vindication, was motivated by his love for our race, superior to others. Delany, and that was page 199. So Marcus Garvey explained the rationale for the strategy in 1919. So these are the words of the Honourable Marcus Garvey. In a world of wolves, one should go armed. And one of the most powerful defence weapons within the reach of Africans is the practice of race first in all parts of the world. So, the words of Marcus Garvey, I repeat, in a world of wolves, one should go armed. One of the most powerful defensive weapons within the reach of Africans is the practice of race first in all parts of the world. Excuse me. So, chapter 2, this is the birth of the genie. The Haitian Revolution is said to have begun on August 22nd, 1791, when thousands of enslaved, crudely armed, with stolen weapons, various tools and torches, overran and destroyed most of the plantations and besieged the towns of the northern Saint-Dominique, the most prosperous European colony in the world at the time. Actually, this well-planned, sustained offensive was the culmination of nearly 3 centuries of periodic African black rebellions against European settlers who imported kidnapped Africans to supply the labour needs. When blacks were first imported into the island, the native population was in the process of being exterminated under the leadership of the relatives of Columbus, who first invaded the islands in 1492. In fact, the first recorded black rebellion seems to have been occurred on the plantations of a son of rebellion, on the plantation of a son of Columbus in 1522. The blacks who were unable at the time to destroy the European settlements retired to the mountains, made alliances with the remaining natives, and settled into free African communities which existed down through the end of the revolution in 1803. These free blacks, who the Europeans called Maroons, were in constant struggle against the settlers. And these struggles intensified when, in the late 17th century, the French took the western part of the island from the Spanish, who had colonized the island first under the name Hispaniola, and later San Domingo. The French called the colony Saint Dominique. Haiti, or High Place, was a native name which was restored by Dessalines after the revolutions. So if I interject here, we're used to calling the island Haiti with a H, but the local people spell the word with a A, A-Y-I-T-I-A-N, Haitian. Yeah. So Haiti will be a correct name for Haiti, beginning with an A, Haiti. But in honor of the people whose island it was, who the Europeans kind of massacred, Jean-Jacques Dessalines renamed it Haiti in their honor. So page 10, Free African Communities and Black Rebellion in Hispaniola, which the Europeans called it early on. A history of African life and black rebellions in Saint Dominique before 1791 would require a separate major work. A brief review, however, is necessary to preclude to an understanding of the revolution. San Domingo, as the whole island was called by the Spanish invaders, was viewed by the early European travellers, including Columbus, as a paradise on earth. The island before the conquest was verdant and generally considered an ideal place to live. It is thus ironic that such human misery and bloodshed occurred there. According to reports, the island, 450 miles long from east to west and 150 miles wide at its widest point, the western part, which resembles the front of a crab with encircling claws, is separated from the eastern two-thirds by a rather rigid mountain chain, which facilitated the fixing of a boundary between France or French and Spanish colonies, and later between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is called today. European settlers or settlements tended to hover around the coast of the island, where the natural harbours were located. The plantations were in the hinterland extensions of these fort cities. Thus, much of the countries under the Spanish as well as French rule was wilderness. In these vast and foreboding wildernesses, there existed almost from beginning, from the European invasion, independent African communities. The relationship between the mutually hostile African and European communities is the matrix of the struggle which began in 1791. And ended with the unequivocal independence of Haiti. The Black Rebellions involved a complex combination of offences from the free communities and uprising on the plantations, including in 1522, the revolt against Columbus. There were three major recorded uprisings against the Spaniards, 1537 and 1548, who are the other dates. These rebellions seem to have started as plantations uprisings which resulted in slaves raising and abandoning the plantations and establishing free communities, organised along the lines of traditional African societies. At this very early date, the rallying cry of the rebellion was "Kill all the whites," which was the emerging spirit of race vindication. Even though these Africans originally came from a variety of places in Africa with different local languages, the cultural linguistic unity of all African people permitted them to form towns that were familiar to all. The social structure was organised to reflect the same type of division common to indigenous African civilizations. Thus generations of free Africans were born and died in these communities, never having been enslaved. This phenomenon was not unique to San Domingo and generally occurred on all colonies which imported significant numbers of Africans. These communities in time moved further and further away from the Spanish settlements. although many remained close enough to wage war against the Spaniards. Thus, when the French started invaded the western part of the island, which was then sparsely populated, the free black communities were already established. It was in these towns that blacks learned to play one European nation against the other. The first French invaders were basically pirates and adventurers, and did not have many confrontations or relations with the blacks. But as other French settled and began importing slaves, war broke out and continued until the revolution was over and the French were gone. In 1679, Padre Jean led a revolt, followed by a widespread rebellion in 1691, led by Junot, Morin, and Perrault. The complex patterns of offensives from the free communities and plantation rebellions produced a large number of African heroes and revered locals. For example, Michel, a leader of the Free Society, in 1719 operated from Lemine, or Bahoroko, a legendary base of the Black Revolt from the late 17th century, down to the Revolution nearly 100 years later. In 1724, a revolt was led by the Kolas, Jambis, Kupis, and in 1730 another by Polydor. Later in 1735, several battles were waged by Polydor from 1761 to 1775. Yes, in 1775, one was led by de Bunche, de Belunche, Noel, and Telemark and Changa. A theme song of the 1971 revolution was dedicated to Changa. Later, there were revolts led by Cabina, Isaac, Pyrrhus, and Candide. So, if I interject, it seems like the Africans in these free communities and even on the plantations knew of all these previous freedom fighters who had been fighting rebellions for many, many, many years. So much so that they actually created a song in honor of Changa. And when the revolution was happening, they used to sing this song. So I continue. The free African communities were depicted as populated by brigands and raiders who were a criminal nuisance to civil life of the colony. Thus, occasionally, military expeditions were organized to seek and find and destroy the camps of these brigands. That is, the free African communities. These communities, which were organized and built according to the general pattern of African society, were designed for defense against such search and destroy missions. The living areas were covered with sharp-pointed stakes. Of course, the lookout system was so efficient that the inhabitants had plenty of time to escape to other prepared places of habitation before the enemy arrived. Many times these vacated villages were lures for the ambush, which was a major defense as well as an offensive tactic of the free Africans who perfected the art of guerrilla warfare long before Ho and Mao or Che came into the scene of history. If I interject here, I know, for example, in Jamaica, the Maroons and many other Maroons, they had elaborate systems to, when, obviously now and again, the European used to create armies together to try and destroy these African communities. They had some serious systems in place they could never touch them. They had early lookouts. They had boulders and stakes. If they came to attack, big boulders would roll down on their head and crush them to death, yeah? So they created a very elaborate system. And also they're like fake cabs, so they'd come there and they'd kind of ambush a camp and there's nobody there. And then the Africans will come in there and lay war on them and probably destroy the troops. So they created many different elaborate systems of defense and attack. So indeed, the act of disappearing into thin air by hundreds and even thousands of free Africans was extremely frustrating to the Europeans-oriented posses, National Guardsmen and soldiers. It lent validity to the fear of the black devils who practiced the dreaded voodoo, who were indeed black magicians. In many cases, members of the search and destroy teams would leave en masse after such a psychological warfare. On one of the expeditions, the enemy was so strung out in unfamiliar territory that the men panicked and many died in the scramble to get home. One celebrated battle story in Haitian history will illustrate the effectiveness of the creativeness of the free Africans engaged in confrontation with European search and destroy missions. In the incident, the French contingent had finally located an important fortified community and had laid siege to the encampment, cutting it off from the fields and communications with the other communities. Thus intending to starve the blacks out, the leaders of the free Africans, however, designed an ingenious plan not only to raise the siege, but to destroy the army. The men secretly slipped into no man's land outside the fort and dug trenches and foxholes which were camouflaged with spikes in them. And then the groups of ragged soldiers would sneak near the enemy lines and begin acting like a drinking party with rum bottles and petty spatting. The European soldiers, seeing an opportunity to wipe out a dozen or so blacks, would leap after these soldiers of these revellers and chase them towards the fort, whereupon the enemy would fall into the ditches and impale themselves. This feat, which was designed to exploit the egotistical psychology of Europeans, was repeated at many points on the enemy lines, resulting in the destruction of more than half of the Europeans. The rest panicked and fled. These free African soldiers could also deal with guns. In the first place, they had got their weapons from the enemy, either by raids on arsenals or by taking them from the fleeing European troops. Raids on arsenals, yes. So secondly, the African method of loading and firing while engaged in battle was awesome, both in terms of firepower, efficiency, and in the psychological impact. Instead of forming two lines, a la European firing lines, which would have discharged their weapons and then stepped behind the second to load it, etc., the African musketeers would fire from a standing or kneeling position, fall into a prone position, roll over while loading, and then fire and load while rising to start again. Needless to say, such practices discourage search and destroy missions. So I must remind you, this is the Afrocentricity Book Show. The studio number is very important. If you'd like to make a comment, the studio number is 079 44 431 366. That is 07944 431 366. Afrocentricity Book Show, sponsored by Glass Are Us. So I continue. The final note in this regard concerns the ability of unarmed Africans to outrun bullets. These free Africans often acted as if they believed themselves invulnerable to bullets, used a combination of psyching up to overcome fear and the application that the bullets shoot straight and gun sights are most efficient against immobile targets. The unnamed African would, by broken field, running and ducking, literally outrun bullets and then vanish into the brush. These examples may enable us to understand why the settlers, with their superior firepower, could not destroy the free African communities. The most memorable hero before the events which began in 1791 was Francois Macandal, so a very famous Macandal, who, according to legend and records, was a Vodun priest and a Muslim from Guinea or Jamaica. Starting about 1751, he led a series of revolts that resulted in the death of several thousand whites. His last campaign, which did not completely materialize, was the organization of urban and plantation enslaved to simultaneously poison all the whites. This plan was detected, and Macandal, who had for over 7 years freely detected among the plantations and free communities, was captured and executed. His plan, death to the whites and black domination of the island, became the foundation of the revolutionary spirit. Here is what a soldier of the revolution said about the revolutionary role of the blacks in the free communities. So this is the words of a soldier. It is from these brave inhabitants of the forest that these are the true founders of our liberty and independence. That we received the great and salutary lessons which we should preserve forever as a preventive against surprise, that we ought to be perfectly on our guard before we suffer a crafty and perfidious foe to approach us, but that the shortest and safest method is to keep as far as possible out of their reach, and never to go near them with our arms in our hands. The rebellions and offences from the free communities continued through much of such leaders as Santiago, forcing the French and Spanish to offer a retreat to the so-called Maroons in 1786. This treaty did not end the revolts. In 1787, revolts were led by Gilo and Hyacinth. Thus, as we can see, the African population largely wrote the history of the island down to the events that are usually said to have triggered the revolution. The patterns that clearly emerges in the survey of the African life in Saint Dominique prior to 1791 is that the guiding genius of black life and rebellion was the quest for liberty and race vindication. Historically, the two prongs of the genius horns were inseparable. Death to the whites and liberty were so linked in the motivation of the rebels that they were almost interchangeable terms. Certainly one could not be conceived without the other. It is true that some of the militants or the militant communities bargained for a guarantee of their own liberty for exchange for a truce with the whites, leaving other blacks enslaved and other whites alive. But these arrangements were always broken by one side or the other, and the genie again became irritated. The lessons that history taught the blacks in Saint Dominique were hard, but they learned a great deal. So this heading here is called A Colonial Society in the Pearl of the Antilles, as IET was called, the Pearl of the Antilles. Saint Dominique was the sugar island which surpassed all other European colonies, and thus France was the envy of the world in the 18th century. The colony was organized according to the general pattern of colonization in the Caribbean and Latin America. The major population divisions in this colonial scheme were by race categories. The general category were whites, mestizos, mulattoes, Indians, and blacks in the hierarchical structure in order. Saint Dominique was a variation because the mestizos, that is white Indian mixture, were absent, as were the Indians because of the previously mentioned extermination by Europeans. Many writers divide the white population into two broad categories, the Grand Blancs and the Petit Blancs, i.e. the large blacks, whites, and the Petit ones, small whites, who I must add was always fight, they hated each other. Yeah, the grand whites were the rich, the plantation holders, and the small whites, the Petit Blancs, were like shopkeepers, common people, and they always hated each other. Such a division, which is largely economic based, has its advantages and disadvantages. For the purpose of this study, however, the most useful primary division is that between the French and the Creole whites. The Creole whites were white people born in the Caribbean. Within each of these groups, of course, there were Grand Blancs and Petit Blancs, big whites and small whites. The French, who were residents or interest holders in Saint-Dominique, were transient and made a clear distinction between themselves and the Creoles. And that is, the Creoles, I remember, are whites who were born in the island. The ones who came from France obviously thought they were superior. These French masters included military, administrative governors, and administrative officials under the authority of France, possessed all of the power of governance over the colony. So if I add really that even though the Grand Blancs, the rich whites, plantation had all the wealth, the people had really the power with the administration because they were under the direct rule of France. There were also the French businessmen and plantation owners who were largely absentee and usually represented by managers and attorneys. The soldiers and sailors who defended the colony against external and internal enemies were also largely French. The Frenchmen resented by the Creoles in the same sense that the American settlers resented the British, especially after 1763, the end of the so-called French-Indian War. The Creole whites were themselves divided into several classes that cannot simply be disposed of or disposed as just Grand Blancs or Petit Blancs. The most powerful class of the Creoles were the planters, who may properly be called the Grand Blancs. They owned most of the island and the slaves and dominated the social life of the European settlements. They were considered the producers of the wealth of the colony. Many of the planters spent most of their time abroad in various European countries. The priests formed another class of Creoles whose attachment it was to all segments of the population in the colony. The interest in the souls of the blacks often conflicted with the planters' interest in their bodies of the blacks, although the priests themselves owned slaves. There were also professional and artisan class of the Creoles who dominated the cities. Finally, there were the white peasants and urban riffraff who were truly the Petit Blancs, as the small whites, and even below them. These latter, of course, were oftentimes reviewed as a nuisance by the other classes of whites. They in turn hated the upper classes, as well as the mulattoes and the blacks who were beneath them. In 1789, there were 40,000 whites on the island. 1789, there were 40,000 whites on the island. Beneath all the whites were the mulattoes, who along with the few free pure blacks formed a stratagem generally designated as free men of colour. They had no societal power, but variously shared in education and wealth, and some were very wealthy. In fact, it is said that the gens of colour, that is people of colour, held a third of the slave property and 1/4 of all the wealth of the Haiti. But contrary to the Black Code, which granted full equality to all freed blacks, they were all oppressed by all classes of whites. So even the mulattoes, mixed race people who were extremely wealthy, they were still below the poorest of the whites. And the poor whites really hated the mulattoes because obviously these people had a lot of wealth. They even had slaves, and plantations, when obviously the poor whites had nothing really. To the extent that they were often prevented from wearing shoes, whereupon the wealthy dams of colour put diamond rings on their toes to flaunt their economic superiority over the poor whites. So what they're saying is that sometimes the whites will make them not even wear shoes. Because they had money, they just put diamond rings on their toes to flaunt their wealth in front of the poor whites. So, in Cap Francois, later called Cape Haitian, the free men of colour were segregated into sections of the city named Little Guinea. Divisions based upon intra-mulatto stratifications existed depending on the percentage of white blood. In fact, these were 10 or more classes of mulattoes, all the way from nearly white to nearly pure black. Each group looked down upon the mixtures lower than theirs in terms of degree of white ancestry. Ironically, Regard, a mulatto leader and hater of the whites, always wore a brunette wig. There were many mulattoes and free blacks who were not wealthy, according to Stewart. This is a quote, many of the free men of colour in the north were poor and black, while the richer mulattoes lived mostly in the west and south of the colony, which was divided into three major regions, north, west and south. While the mulattoes were generally considered to be the haters of the black slaves from whom they had descended, many were not. Those who owned plantations often related to their slaves like the Grand Blancs or worse. Many others sympathized with and aided and abetted the blacks, especially those trying to escape from their masters. Many gave valuable assistance to the Maroons. The mulatto class was by no means monolithic and anti-black. In 1789, there were 30,000 mulattoes in Saint Dominique. At the base of the colony were obviously the blacks, and more properly the enslaved, which is about 10% of the slaves. About 10% of the enslaved were mulattoes, mixed race. There were about 500,000 to 700,000 enslaved, or about 10 for every non-slave. These enslaved were organized into various classes, headed by gross Negroes and overseers, some whom actually ran the whole plantation. There were also house and field servants who ranked in that order. The skilled slaves and urban slaves also led a different life than did the masses of the field slaves. There were also distinctions with subtle rankings among the African ethnic groups from which the slaves came. Senegalese generally were ranked higher than the Congos. The Creole slaves, again, more highly regarded than those newly arrived from Africa. In 1879, more than half of the slaves had been born in Africa. Many of the slaves had gardens of their own, and many had various sources of petty income. Their markets and trading were part of the small commerce of the island. The slaves were more or less subversives to other population groups on the colony. They ran away, played sick, stole valuables, oftentimes assaulted and killed their masters, sometimes through poisoning and sometimes through voodoo. More importantly, many slaves, along with many of the free blacks and mulattoes, were in constant communication with the blacks outside of the colony, in the free communities, the so-called Maroons. The voodoo religion, which was practically all blacks' practice, brought these various groups into common meeting, where celebrations and conspiracies regularly occurred. The importance of these black networks cannot be overestimated in relation to the regular rebellions that finally culminated in the revolution. So I'm going to take a quick pause there. I must remind you, this is the Afrocentricity Book Show. We are on Blessed Radio every Sunday between 4 and 6. We look at the world. We read the best books, essays, lectures from the perspective of Africans, perspective of black people. African-centered eyes gaze over all the things we do see. Because sadly, we are, because of our most recent history, we as African people have been knocked off our own terms, of our own centre, of our own culture. And many of us see the world through the eyes of other people. So this show is really about us seeing the world again through our own eyes. So we can move together in unity to do what we need to do, okay, to flourish. So we're going to take a short break and we'll be back at the other end. So this is Afrocentricity Book Show. I'll be back after a short break.
From the day my born, when it done no say Michael are the first. I ain't no last. So you expect I kill a search. That's the for the youth. Look, woman and child, you, yeah. For you I really have so much love. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. Could never make I so proud. Black woman and child, oh yeah. For you I got so much love, dollar bills and coins will fade away. They could never make I proud. Alone, motherland Africa still remains so fine. Empresses and emperors living from in those times. I know you're the first to give birth and took mankind. Now let me say you're the hurt, being Omega's divine. Take her to die and I give thy praise. That's where my covenant will be always. How have you been going through those stages? You've been away for many days. Love, woman and child, you, yeah. For you I really have so much love. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. Only you could make I proud. Yeah. Black woman and child, you, yeah. For you I really have so much love. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. They never yet make I proud. Who knows who will tread upon your road just to make things great. Oh yeah, you and the children, I see them in front of your face. I say, keep them close as you live, increase their faith. Marcus Garvey don't save him, save the future from AIDS. Oh, naturally nature is the way to your needs. You were born as the one to conceive, now let my joy put away your grief. You and the child as smooth as the breeze. Woman and child, you, yeah. For you I'm having so much fun, yeah. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. They could never put I down. Hey, black woman and child, you, yeah. For you I have so much love. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. They would never make I proud. Alone, one those standing at your door, dressed in Ethiopian clothes, coming more and more. Oh, what a lovely day! The blessing is so pure. Someone conceived today of this, I am sure. Yeah. Black woman and child, you, yeah. For you have got so much love. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. They never yet make I proud. Oh, black woman and child, you, yeah. For you I have so much love. Dollar bills and coins will fade away. anyway. The never you make I'm proud. Say it aloud. Camel and Africa still remain so fine. Empresses and emperors living from in those times. I know you're the first to give birth unto mankind. Now let me say you're the earth, Queen of Eagles divine. Oh, 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 take I to Zion, I give I praise. That's where my covenant will be always. How have you been going through those days? Dumping away for many years, yeah.
Until the philosophy which old one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited.
No one remember old Marcus Garvey. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. No one remember him. No one. Talking about Paul Booker. They've been talking about William Gordon. They've been talking about Norman Washington Manley, including Buster Manley. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. Fine style. John D. Baptist, Edward Cutter. We get away into Osasa. Stephen disciples of the world, Lord, believe me, yes, they stoned him to death. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. This is the right way. This way is the right way. This way is the right way. All what got to do is let true black love arise and hatred scatter, even melt off out the fire like the wax. Yes, no one remember old Marcus Garvey. No one remember old Marcus Garvey. Children, 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 humble yourself and become one day somehow.
Shout it out loud, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise that Marcus Garvey fought for yesterday? It was still fighting for today, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise that Bob Marley fought for yesterday? It was still fighting for today, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise Martin Luther King fought for yesterday? It was still fighting for today, yeah. This may be harsh to say, but we're living in a white world. It's a statement that many fear to say, but Jah is our protector and we fear not to say. It's a prejudice world, yeah. It's a prejudice world. Where is the black man's paradise Malcolm X fought for yesterday? And we're still
philosophy that gives them superiority, calling us minority, and in their heart they know we're the majority. It's a prejudice world, yeah, in a prejudice world. Where is the black man's paradise? Harriet Tubman fought for yesterday, and we're still fighting for today. Yes, yeah. Where is the black man's paradise? Sister Nanny fought for yesterday, and we're still fighting for today.
Yes, greetings. We are back again with the Afrocentricity Book Show. Hope you like that short little musical break. We are Sunday, 4 to 6, every Sunday, Afrocentricity Book Show. Please ensure you tune in, tell your friends about it. This show is sponsored by Glass Are Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road. You can get them on 0208 800 6663. That is 0208 800 6663. Go to Glass Are Us for all your glazing needs. You'll get a 10% discount if you mention the show. Glass Are Us is sponsored. We are reading today. This is the first Afrocentricity book show of the new year, and we are reading a great book called The Irritated Genie, an essay on the Haitian Revolution, and it's written by Baba Jacob H. Carruthers. Professor Jacob Carruthers, who passed away a few years ago now, but he's one of his great, he left us many books. It's one of the great books where he left us as well, So we're reading The Irritated Genie, Essays on the Haitian Revolution, by Dr. Jacob Carruthers. And we're going to continue. So we're still in the first chapter. This heading is The Black Peril and the French Revolution. So, Black Rebellion and the fear of a Black Revolution were the prime considerations of colonial governments and society in Saint Dominique. The defection of the slaves individually and in groups was so common that a full labor force was the exception in most plantations. Raids by the armies of the free communities were a constant threat to plantation life. Certain areas were so populated by free communities that European settlers were afraid to stake land claims beyond the frontiers of the settlement enclaves. Although the Black Codes of Louis XIV, established in 1685, had attempted to deal with this problem of black revolt through provisions for manumissions of certain blacks, that's a freedom, manumissions of certain blacks, granting equality for free blacks, a due process of the punishment of slaves, and severe penalties for maroonage. By the first quarter of the 18th century, special repressive and brutal methods were frequently invoked. The whites were so desperate that they begged the free coloureds for help, and upon being refused, ordered them to assist. In 1721 and 1733, special police were organised to deal with the free communities. In 1776, a combined force of French and Spanish Creoles, together with a group of mulattoes, attempted to destroy the Babaruka communities, but were utterly humiliated, and among other indignities, had to drink their own urine before returning to the European settlements. It seems as though the Maroons could disappear at will, and thus they were never in the trap which the Europeans with so much precision tried to spring. Finally, in 1786, the colony offered a treaty recognizing the freedom and territorial claims territorial claims of one group of free Africans. This was 5 years before the revolution. So as you know, I interject here that they only want to sit around the table when they're losing. Apart from that, they always want to crush you, our enemy, yeah? Our enemy always wants to crush us. The only time they want to sit down and talk with you is when you know you got the upper hand on them, because they're not interested in talking, yeah? There's so many things we can learn from the Haitian Revolution, yeah? The Haitian Revolution. I continue. In the interval between 1786 treaty and with the Free African and the explosion of 1791 events in France and the colony have produced bitter conflicts among the various classes of whites and mulattoes. First of all, the planters, inspired by the American War for Independence, in which numerous people from Santa Dominique had participated, demanded more autonomy or even independence from the French government. At the same time, the organised mulattoes were demanding that the Black Code guarantees be enforced. Both of these groups were arch enemies, and they were staunch supporters of the chattel slave system. In fact, they thought that they could better contain the blacks without the French interference. Then in 1789, when the French Revolution erupted and Republicans came to power, a colonial assembly was authorized by the French legislature. This assembly was dominated by the planters, who increased their suppression of the mulattoes who revolted. The struggle between the white planters and the mulatto planters can better be understood when one considers that the white planters dominated the northern part of the island, and the mulattoes dominated the southern part of the island. Thus through brutally suppressed, the mulattoes continued to wage war. In 1790, the colonial assembly voted itself such vast authority that the French colonial government and the colonists clashed in a civil war. And in the spring of 1791, France granted full rights to the free men of colour. Their rights were rescinded a few months later and restored again in 1792 with the petty blancs assaults on the mulattoes. Thus, the white mulatto war intensified in the meantime. The blacks, who had been plotting for 5 years, began to make their final plans. The tripartite war among French, Creoles and mulattoes was an ideal time to renew the struggle for black liberation. Then the black irritated genie exploded across the island with the fury of the annual tropical hurricane. So that's the end of the chapter 2. So let me just say, as you may have noticed, the enslaved Africans were the majority. Anything between 500,000 to 700,000 wasn't really in any of these talks. The whites, two groups of whites really, the mulattoes, were all arguing and fighting amongst each other. And that's why there was chaos on the island. The mulattoes wanted rights. The whites, even the poor whites, and some of these mulattoes, I said, were very, very wealthy. They said for number one, they couldn't call themselves monsieur. They couldn't wear French clothes. They couldn't wear shoes. And they say, well, how can you treat us like this? The French codes put down by Louis XIV granted us rights, but obviously they just ignore the right and say, well, you're not white and us whites are superior to you, so you do what we say. They couldn't buy guns, they couldn't buy arms, yeah, they couldn't even carry a sword. So they did everything because their fear was that, because they knew they treated the mulattoes so harshly, and they knew that mulattoes have sort of African blood in their veins, their fear was that they would join with the enslaved blacks, the enslaved Africans, anytime they needed to be. So they, even though they kind of treated them so despicably, they really feared that, because they knew that if there was a revolt, these mulattoes would join with, all the Africans, But sad thing about it, the psychological problem, the mulattoes hated the blacks, because of that African blood in their veins, they felt that they didn't get the Jews the rights that they were due. And even so, in every group there was a war. There was problems amongst the whites with the administration, because the administration represented the French government. There was the rich whites and also the poor whites. They had their own issues. Then also the mulatto group felt that they should have the rights of, particularly the free ones, under the codes, which is the legal codes put there. They was always arguing with the whites as well. The whites did everything they could to make sure these mulattoes had nothing. And there wasn't just a simple mulatto group. If you had a relationship with a European, obviously your child would be 50-50, half African blood, half European blood. But they put it down to the 8th of European blood, 16th of European blood, 32nd of European blood, 64th. You won't believe it. They had about 10 within the mulatto. They had about 10 octoroon and a quadroon. It's like a joke. But all these people would look down on the one below them because they believe that, well, I've got less African blood or more European blood. So within every group on the island, there was a problem. There was friction. There was argument. But before the Haitian Revolution broke out in 1791, the whites and the mulattoes, the administration, were all fighting amongst each other. They were lynching each other, hurting each other. And obviously when there was the French Revolution occurred, and obviously the monarchy was defeated, they stormed the Bastille and they became Republicans now. The petty whites, or the poor whites, they all joined like a revolutionary force. And they made sure that the mulattoes were kept down, and they also argued with the administration that we want more rights. So there was actually chaos going on in Haiti even before the revolution, which we all know started. So let me start chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called The Evocation of the Genie. The irritating genie of Haiti was called forth during the celebration of Ogun's festival in 14th of August 1791. Ogun was the personification of the Vodun spirit of warfare and iron. The event took place in a forest near what at the time was called Cape Francois, the colonial capital. Bookman, as he was generally known, was a voodoo priest, and he planned the launching of the revolution with Ogun's celebration, in keeping with the time-tested tradition among African people whose human events must be coordinated with cosmological forces and ancestral spirits. The revolution thus had its roots in the African worldview. So what is not mentioned in this book is the priestess. There was a priestess called Cecile Fatiman. She was a mambo. What's a mambo? A voodoo priestess. And she called this meeting in consultation with Bookman. Bookman must have said to her, okay, we need to call a meeting. So she called a meeting. And it wasn't thousands of people in this meeting. There was a few dozens in this meeting, But they met, they sacrificed, they made an oath, they organised, they looked at the astronomical findings as well. And the ancestors, obviously the ancestors. One thing we as African people, because we moved away from our own spiritual systems, we forget about our ancestors, which is crazy. Some of the things that do happen to us, maybe happen to us because we don't speak to our ancestors. We need to move back to our spiritual systems. And as you see the power of this, you see as I read through this book, you see the power of going back to who you are and the power of that. But the point was making here, the meeting or they organised had its roots in the African worldview, to look at the world through their own eyes. On that historic night, after a series of planning meetings, Bookman called together a group of black leaders from the free African communities. the plantations and the urban areas of the north in order to announce the schedule for the offensive. Bookman Show, as his full name, depicted as a savage voodoo priest who led an eerie blood-drinking ceremony before sending forth hordes of crazed blacks to burn, rape and plunder, had been a gross Negro and overseer at one time one of the northern plantations. He was actually widely respected among, that's how the Europeans obviously would depict him, some sort of crazy blood-drinking crazy person, yeah, who told the blacks to rape and burn and murder. Okay, but you must understand what's happening in the island. If I give you a little bit of idea, the whites, French, Creoles, French born in the Caribbean, they had the most brutal system you could imagine. So if I give you an idea of some of the things, what they would do sometimes, for example, they put gunpowder inside an African and blow him to pieces. One lady, so cakes weren't cooked well, very rich lady, European lady, she threw the African slave woman into the oven to burn. So they had the most brutal system you can imagine. But then they will talk about how brutal Bookman these people are, but they could never be as brutal as which they faced of being enslaved on this island. But what's key here is that Bookman, he was one of the most widely respected among all the blacks on the island, and was fearfully regarded among the whites, and he had the ability to command unity among the black leaders, and with divergent motives and ambitions. On August 22nd, he was selected as that night was selected as the night for the revolt to begin, and the signal was to be a fire visible through the region. So they planned everything, and they said, when you see the fire burning, that is the sign to start the revolution. So during this meeting, Bookman said a prayer. It's a very famous prayer. If you just Google it, Bookman's prayer, you'll see it, yeah? And this is the prayer what he said to get everybody up, get everybody ready, get everybody sing off the same hymn sheet, shall we say, to look through at the world through their own eyes, to think about this is what we need to do, and this is the reason why. So at the celebration, Bookman eloquently charged the assembly with the wisdom of the black rebels from past times. He will say, death to the whites, destroy the colonial settlements, and black dominion. And also, he also uttered in Creole, and this is Bookman's prayer, this is what Bookman said, it's very famous. Good God, who created the sun, who shines on us from above, who rouses the sea and makes the thunder rumble. Listen, God, though hidden in the clouds, watches over us. The God of the white man calls forth crime, but our God wills good works. Our God who is good commands us to avenge us. He will direct our arms and help us. So he goes on, he says, throw away the likeness of the white man's God, who so often has brought down our tears, and listen to liberty, which speaks in all our hearts. So that's a bit more of it, but that is the Bookman's prayer, which is very famous. So he says, the God of the white people has always brings down our tears. So he said, get rid of that God. It's no good for us, no good to us at all. Listen to the God who's inside of us. Even though he's hidden in the cloud, he's in us, and he will guide us to vengeance. Because our God does good. So he's talking about, it wasn't about doing bad, it was about doing good, it's about vengeance, it's about balancing the scales. This evocation on the night of the celebration of the voodoo spirit, Ogun, the god of war, was more than a call to arms. It was even more a summation of the historical experience of blacks on the island of Santo Domingo, and indeed the diaspora in general. At the same time, the prayer was not a mere ideological statement. It was all of these, but more importantly, it was expression of the Afrocentric worldview. In articulating the God of the white man calls forth crime, but our God wills good, Bookman was asserting that white culture and black culture were diametrically opposed to each other. That is, the motive force of white culture, as embodied in his contempt of God, inspires one to do crime. brutal exploitation of human beings, slavery, plunder, destruction of nature, lust for power and wealth, and pathological impulse to master everything. Saint Dominique was a living example of the correctness of Bookman's assessment. When Bookman implored the black group assembled at the celebration of Ogun, throw away the symbol of the god of the whites, he was doing more than just spewing forth a military rhetoric. He was setting forth the first principle of black revolutionary commitment, which had inspired the historic rebellions on the island. The white god inspires one to get as high on the pyramid of power and wealth as possible by any means necessary, because your Eurocentric success is not just liberty in ordinary African sense, but it necessitates dominion as an essential property or an essential ingredient of the good life. This is a pursuit of happiness, i.e. pursuit of happiness about property, in the modern European sages, as the modern European sages call it. And as long as the motive force of black revolt was imitation of that success syndrome, revolution was impossible. So I think it's saying there that as long as they just wanted to ape what Europeans were doing, revolution was impossible. You had to be yourself. So thus, throw away the image of the god of the whites, who has often brought down our tears, was a demand and warning for those blacks who had been given privileged positions relative to the masses of the blacks. Those who were impressed and motivated by those phantoms of individual freedom were admonished to abandon fantasy and to join the true struggle for freedom. This warning was also directed against the rich and imitative mulattoes who had embraced the god of the whites and who were at that time weeping and groaning because of the brutal rejection by their idols, the Grands and the Petit Blancs. It was also meant for the strata which had been created among the blacks, slaves, and especially the ambitious among the leaders, who were all too obvious. Indeed, it was this refusal to abandon the god of the whites that vitiated the struggle for so many years, and which finally divided the post-revolutionary Haitian society, a division that unfortunately still frustrates the country even today. Race vindication is this heading. Only when blacks are purged of the white man's images can they become possessed by the irritated genie. Bookman asserted that God commands us to vengeance. This is the indispensable motive force to inspire all of the Africans' descendants to unify against the common oppressor. This is the true spirit of race vindication. But this was not merely an emotional command from a frustrated savage leader. It was rather what Holly meant when he said that Bookman directed their fury, as the insurgents, into a desperate struggle for liberty and revenge. He saw the sound and realistic approach to bring to fruition the almost 3 centuries of black rebellion against slavery and racial oppression. The unity of the whites in maintaining and supporting 300 years of brutal slavery made such a motive force the natural and logical response. The blacks had been brutally kidnapped from their homeland. The work on the plantations was such a travail that blacks were literally worked to death. Let me just say, generally, when they got to the island, within 6 years they were dead. 18-hour days, they worked from can't see till can't see. They woke up before the sun rose and went to bed after the sun went down. 18-hour days. So the life expectancy of many was about 6 years once they were taken from Africa. The average lifespan after being sold into slavery, it says here, was about 7 years. Thousands were murdered or maimed because of refusal to obey commands. Black women were raped. The so-called free blacks were humiliated constantly. In short, the black people had been the victims of the most oppressive and miserable system of tyranny in history. Surely revenge guided them, guided by wisdom, and tempered with the desire for the liberty which speaks in all our hearts, was the appropriate guiding spirit. The words warned against the temptation that so often stops rebellious efforts to victory. The offer of whites to make a deal. The negotiations between the settlers and the free American communities from 1776 to 1866 were examples of this shortcoming. The whites, unable to defeat the blacks, offered a tempting deal. The black leaders despairing over seamlessly endless struggle involving danger and deprivation, desiring peace, security and comfort, are tempted to sell out. The whites offered immunity, supplies and reserved land to a chosen few rebels if they would abandon the rebellions and help to round up the other rebels. But the revolutionary was reminded that the goal was not personal liberty, security and comfort, but to revenge our wrongs, i.e. the wrongs against the African race on the island. Bookman, liberty, speaks in all of our heart. If the blacks honoured God's command in this regard, he will direct our arms and help us. Thus the struggle couldn't be abandoned until the blacks were completely free from white dominion. There was then no negotiation possible, only a fight to destroy the oppressor and commitment to conquer or die. When the enemy was destroyed, then and only then could the race be avenged. So this headed his strategy. The Bookman's war plan consisted of at least 5 somewhat overlapping phases. Number 1, the commitment or the simultaneous self-emancipation of the blacks. 2, kill all the whites and burn all the crops in the area of cultivation. 3, burn the cities. 4, set up camps populated by men, women and children and begin cultivation of crops in the old free community fashion, while making raids against the presumed French reinforcements, this thus decimating the European troops. And 5, finally destroy the French forces and then turn on the Spaniards to drive them from the eastern section of the island and thus dominate the island by Africans. This was, this was of course an excellent battle plan in keeping with the goal of race vindication. The self-emancipation of all blacks was designed to cause all blacks en masse to abandon their slave stations and become a vast, all-pervading, formless liberation army. Like the irritated genie itself, the psychological impact of this sea of blacks crashing across the plains will be devastating. Let me remind you, this is the Afrocentricity Book Show. I am reading The Irritated Genie by Jacob H. Carruthers. This show is sponsored by Glass Are Us, 730 Seven Sisters Road. You can get them on 0208 800 6663. So please go to Glass Are Us for all your glazing needs. This self-emancipation, though massive, through massive rebellion, would naturally be accompanied by the killing of all whites in this cascading black tide. The burning of all the crops would finish off the colonial economy, because along with the slaves, the crops constituted the wealth of the island. The burning of the elites The burning of the cities, which would have been state sieged by these swarming masses from the countryside, fell primarily to the urban blacks, who would be the first to strike a blow and blow up the arsenals. In the meantime, having raised the area of cultivation and creating a wide band of no man's land, they would recede into the hills and establish camps. These camps would be modelled after the free African communities and provide a habitat for the whole black population, women and children alike. The members of these communities not directly engaged in battle would have the primary responsibility of raising crops for the army and the community. When the expected French military reinforcements would arrive from France, the Liberation Army would harass, ambush and retreat and strike again from behind. Weapons would be obtained from victories. In time, deprived of their logistical support, the French would turn on the Spaniards and push them off the eastern section of the island, with the ensuing establishment of black rule. The irritated genie would be satisfied. The race would be avenged. In Bookman's plan, there was no compromise. Blacks would either conquer or die. So this heading here is the longest season. The first month of the revolution was faithful to this revolutionary philosophy. What was often described as a frenzied melee of murder, hideous torture, rape and pillage did in fact systematically deprive the settlers' colonies of its wealth and security. Started on August 22nd, 1791, the genie struck. The masses of blacks wreaked a path of destruction in the northern plains, setting all the buildings and crops aflame and killing nearly all white people. That phase of the operation proceeded as planned. This activity resulted in clearing the countryside of whites. Those who escaped with their lives scurried into the cities. The cities were virtually cut off from one another except by sea, and even here the boats and ships were to be harassed from the shore between the ports. The besieging of the cities was virtually accomplished as planned. The disaster from the standpoint of the whites was dismal. Rainsford begins his description thusly. While the perfect calm seemed to evade every contending interest, i.e. among white people and mulattoes, the morning before daybreak a sudden, confused alarm spread throughout the town of the Cape that the Negro slaves in the neighbouring parishes had revolted, were murdering the whites, were setting fire to the plantations. Nothing certain could be collected till dawn. Even the reports were too sadly confirmed by the arrival of numbers just escaped with life, who, begging for protection from the towns, communicated their particulars. As terror spread, women, children, and as many black slaves as could be found were herded up and put on board ships, and the able-bodied men would try to mobilize them for battle. Excuse me. These were soon overcome by the black tide and had to scurry back into the cities. Terror spread again as some of the mulattoes at the time joined the black revolutionaries. To cap it all off, the whites found that the blacks in the city had robbed the arsenal and turned a large quantity of weapons over to the insurgents. The sacking of the cities was not immediately completed because of the mobilization of the French forces. Shortly thereafter, the white colonists, with the air of feigned arrogance, demanded a cessation of hostilities. About the middle of September, the blacks, still true to Bookman's guidance, replied with a bold defiance. They said, "God who fights For the innocent is our guide. He will never abandon us. Conquer or die, this is our motto, which we will maintain until the last drop of our blood. Hence liberty or death. We will never change our motto. So that was a pretty good answer. Because I think the arrogance of the whites thought, you better give in now, because they thought that there's no way they could keep this up. You blacks don't know what you're doing. You better give in now, and then we'll be kind on you. But they just said, our God is with us. We will never give up. It's either liberty or it's our death. The note signed all the generals and chiefs of our arms was undoubtedly authored by Bookman. The similarity between the assertion or the assertion of what he called Bookman's prayer is unmistakable. There is no hint of negotiation, no room for making a deal. The only thing the French could do was leave the island. The alternative was death to all Frenchmen. The answer by the whites on September 23rd, 1791 was characteristically arrogant. They demanded that the leaders of the insurrection be handed over for punishment, promising leniency to the masses of blacks if they would return to slavery. The blacks' answer was another long month of destruction. In the meantime, the whites called on France, traditional enemy, the British, for salvation. The British, who virtually controlled the seas, sent 2 ships to the rescue on September the 26th, 1971. Ironically, one of the ships was named the Blonde. The whites, fearing a complete black takeover, offered the British the whole colony if only they would stop the blacks. The British refused, and the colonists could only hope for assistance from France. The prospects indeed seemed dim. Nonetheless, the whites acted in characteristic fashion. They increased the merciless torture and maiming of blacks while executing them for no particular offence, but because they were blacks. Indeed, it seemed as though the whites were trying to guarantee that the blacks would have a fresh motivation for race vindication. This reckless brutality was also a reflection of the despondency and pessimism among the whites. The reasoning seemed to be, since we are doomed, let us enjoy the misery of slow agonizing death to as many blacks as we can dispatch. The period between August 22nd and November 22nd, 1791 was indeed a long season for the whites. It was thus somewhat surprising that on the latter date, the blacks began petitioning for peace and accommodation. The change resulted in a radical change of leadership among the rebellion blacks. Bookman was killed in the early part of the November. Jeannot, who was the top lieutenant, probably took over from an interval but was assassinated by Francois, allegedly because he was a madman. Whether this was an act motivated by personal ambition or principal disagreement, the philosophy of the revolution changed. The chant of conquer and die was gradually silenced. With the change, race vindication, race vengeance was abandoned by the leadership. The irritated genie had wrought terror upon the enemies of black people. Its reward was to be replaced by another revolutionary spirit, the phantoms of liberty. It would seem that the new leaders had a special talent of snatching defeat from the very certain jaws of victory. Bookman's plan had worked remarkably well. The northern plains were razed, the cities were locked in. The insurrections had spread to the west at Port-au-Prince, capital of the south, was threatened. Many mulattoes had joined the blacks. Conquest was only a matter of time. The motive force, race vindication, would give them fortitude and endure and reap the rewards. The rest of Bookman's strategy was only needed execution. So we're coming up to the last 10 minutes now. We're going to leave chapter 5 and chapter 4 until next week's show. So this is The Irritated Genie. So by Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers. Essays in Haitian Revolution. January the 1st, 1804 was the independence from this Haitian Revolution which we are speaking about now. So I thought it's very important that we get the grips to understand what's going on there. So there was chaos in the island. Let me say that this island was the richest island or the richest colony in the world. British's strongest or wealthiest colony was Jamaica. But this island was probably making 10 times what Jamaica's making. It was literally making billions every year. They not only sold sugar, but they sold tobacco, indigo, cotton. They grew so many different things. And the wealth that it brought to France, you can't understand it. Because all the ports, Bordeaux and many of the French ports, became rich because of this. Because shipping kind of grew. And all the goods which they produced for this colony was produced from there as well. The slave trade, which went to obviously they went to the Africa to get the enslaved people kidnapped. They went back and sold it. It was a crazy amount of wealth that was created. But this colony, they call it the Pearl of the Antilles, was the richest colony in the world. That's why the British later on wanted to come in there, because their richest colony was Jamaica, and this colony was making far more than they were. But probably next week we'll see that Toussaint Louverture, he became the leader, and he went back to a lot of Bookman's ways. And we'll see though, during these few years, because it went on for about 13 years, this whole struggle, they changed ideas, what we should do, but ultimately Dessalines took over right at the end, as you'll see, and they got their due. Africans got their due, and the Europeans got their due. So again, this is Afrocentricity Book Show. So let me remind you what Afrocentricity is. Afrocentricity is a concept of black people moving back to their centre, to their own grounds, to doing things which are in their favour, in their benefit, in line with their values and their interests. Okay? There are 3 I's we can remember. 3 I's. What are the 3 I's? Identity. Once we identify as African people, then we'll know what the second I, our interests are. And once we know what our interests are, that should shape our intentions, our behaviour, our actions. So always remember the 3 I's. Identity, interests, and actions. So Afrocentricity, again, we will see the world for a change through our own eyes like we used to. So everything we do is through our own eyes. Sadly at the moment we see the world through the eyes of other people. With Afrocentricity, it opens us up. It will define for us what is true and what is false. It will define to us the reality of the world, and so we don't live in falsehood. With people hold things up to us and we think, oh, democracy, that's good, or let's follow democracy, or let's follow religion, yeah, or let's follow equal opportunities, or let's follow multicultural society, and we go from left to right, from pillar to post, and we never get what we need for ourselves. It's very important that we get what we need for ourselves, which is justice. Nothing more, nothing less. We need justice for who we are, and we'll only do that by understanding who we are and then moving as one people. So a key part of Afrocentricity is understanding our history. Because when we understand our history, we know exactly who we are. At the moment, we're seeing ourselves through the eyes of other people who think very poorly of Africans. And if we adopt or believe those histories that are given to us, we'll feel very poorly about ourselves. And when we feel poorly about ourselves, we have low self-esteem, self-doubt, self-hatred. Our self-concept is very, very, very poor. However, once we know our history, we'll understand exactly who we are. what we have done, where we need to go in the future. I think, as John Henry Clark says, it's a compass that you use to tell the time of day by. And it not only tells you where you have been and where you are, but it tells you where you still must go as well. So Afrocentricity is an excellent philosophy because it is us. We just to return to the font, return back to who we are again, so we can move through the world as African people. Because you get Asians moving through the world as Asians, and you get Europeans moving through the world as Europeans. We just need to go through the world with who we are. And then we will remember our ancestors. We will adopt maybe our own spiritual systems again. And then we'll be able to strengthen our communities and strengthen our nations and move forward as we need to move forward. At the moment, because we're not moored, we're not grounded, we're not centered, we're blowing around like leaves or like a tree in the wind, from left to right, from right to left, because we are not grounded on who we are. It's very important we return to our own terms, return to just being African people, who we are, and then we will see who we are and we know what we need to do. This will also bring unity within our community as well, because even though we may feel good about individually, well, I'm very proud and I'm very confident who I am, as a group, because of the history we've been given by others, we don't maybe feel as strong about the group as we should. Sadly, we've been given a history which is kind of false. And if you believe that history shapes who you believe you are, if we are guided by a false history, we are guided, or our beliefs of who we are is based on a false foundation, not a strong, truthful foundation. So it's very important that we understand our history, that we are the oldest people on the planet, that we build some of the early civilizations, and not just civilizations, but peaceful civilizations, that we were the pioneers of science and technology and architecture and medicine and all these kind of disciplines, the scientific disciplines, we still rule the world today. The first calendar was created by black people. The first writing in the world was created by black people. The first religious writings in the world was created by black people. So when we understand who we are and we come to terms, we begin to love ourselves again, then we'll be able to move on the correct road. Because if you don't know where you're going, maybe because you don't know who you are, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. But we cannot take any road. We must get our bearings again. We must be centered again. We must be grounded again, and then we'll know which road we need to take. And that road we need to take is Liberation Road. Because the thing with Liberation Road is that, or Liberation Train, if you want to call it that way, many of us have got different baggage. And say you want to board Liberation Train, then may you have to stop at the date and say, well, you need to leave that behind, and leave that behind, and leave that behind, because you cannot take it onto Liberation Train. So what things might we need to leave behind? That we may have to leave our skin bleaching cream behind, and our Jerry curl perm, so we can perm our hair and stuff like that, yeah? We may need to leave our names behind, or even our religion behind. So we need to assure ourselves of the things what not us, and then board this Liberation Train with just our own identity. When we have our own identity, we can move forward as we need to move forward in a straight line, yeah? We will face problems here and there, but with unity, we will go anywhere and do anything we need to do. There is a concept from the Akan people, which is in many people in Ghana, and it's called Sankofa. Sankofa is symbolized by a bird. A bird is facing one way, but its head is turned backwards. So what it symbolizes is that the need sometimes, if you run into problems, there may be a need to look behind us, go to our history to see what we did before when we run into these problems. So when you go back and see what you did in the past, then we can use that information and march through into the future again, strong again, because we've got the information we need and we march forward. So Sankofa is excellent philosophy to learn from the past. By learning from the past, we can move forward strongly into the future. I mean, if we don't learn from the past, unfortunately, the mistakes we made in the past, we will continue to make them over and over again. However, when you learn from the past, we just cut those mistakes out. We can move into the future very strongly. And with unity, this is not what we can accomplish. We can continue reading this book, Irritated Genie, next week, and you'll see when they're unified and went back to their own culture, and the old concept of God, they beat the three superpowers of the age. I think, as I said earlier, Napoleon, he sent his best troops there. His best troops would beat every single army in Europe and Asia. And when he sent it to Saint Dominique, those troops weren't they couldn't handle what they had to face with these Africans, who knew they were Africans, and they adopted their own concept of God, the Vodun religion. We must remember the word Vodun just means God, put simply. So we're seeing God through our own eyes, and we could just move on with that. Okay. So again, this is the Afrocentric Book Show. We will continue again reading the Irritated Genie next week. I want you guys to have a great week, and I'll see you again. So have a great week, yeah. And we will continue reading this great book by Jacob H. Carruthers. The book is called Irritated Genie, Essays in Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is something we should really need to come to grips with. We need to teach our children about as well, because it's about so many of the things we can use today as we move forward today into the future, okay? And things like unity, strength, being ourselves, not copying others, yeah? Understanding what our culture is, understanding what our purpose is in life, okay? So this is the Afrocentric Book Show. This is Brother Jegna tuning out. Hope you enjoyed this, yeah, this show today, and I'll see you again next week, yeah, every Sunday between 4 and 6 p.m. So you have a great week, and you take care. I'll see you next time.
What you feeling down for? No, I like that.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Better days are coming by and by. We can make it if we try. Come on. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up.
Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Look around and then I see a little old man and a homeless lady. They don't have no food to eat. Father, give them a warm place to sleep. Come on, wake up the people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up the people, Lord, wake up.
Wake up. Wake up. Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now.
Wake up. Wake up. Wake up.
Wake up the people, wake up. Wake up, people, wake up now. Storms will come and storms will go. The earth may quake and still the souls of us.